Hello, everyone. I'm Gabriel, and I'll be the new host of the PermafrostNet seminars for the time being. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Frederic, who is a PhD candidate at Carleton University. So he has a background in geosciences and remote sensing. His passion for dynamic permafrost landscapes started during his graduate thesis at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar Research. Here he studied forest stand structure in the tundra taiga ecotone of Northeast Siberia using drones. His main research interest is using geomatics tools and field investigation to improve our understanding of landscape change and thaw sensitivity in permafrost regions, focusing on community priorities. Take it away, Frederic.
So yeah, thanks for the great introduction. So today I would like to talk about the results for one of my PhD chapters. I'm a late-stage PhD student in the geography department at Carleton University. And this chapter deals with the permafrost terrain disturbances in a watershed, a sub-watershed of the Yukon River, the Nacho Nyäk Tagé watershed, which is on the traditional territory of the First Nation of Nacho Nyäk Tagé, with which I'm collaborating. And yeah, my project deals with mapping these disturbances and then modeling the susceptibility towards the disturbances to learn more about the behavior, specifically about retrogressive thaw slumps and the larger thermal erosion features in the watershed. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without the great research collaboration that the geography department of Carleton University has with the First Nation of Na-Cho Nyäk Tagé. This is based on a memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2020 between Carleton University and the First Nation government to collaborate on multidisciplinary research projects. And specifically, the relationship between the NND Lands and Resource Department and people from the geography department has been really amazing. And there has been a lot more research coming out of this from other students, including work on water quality, wetland hydrology, the cumulative effects across the watershed, and permafrost risks. And on top of that, there has been amazing opportunities for capacity building. We had some geomatics training sessions with the land staff. And every time we go out with some of them, there's always something to learn about the nature and the landscape there. So I just want to thank a few people that I've been working with closely, including Gary Hope, Brian Moses, now Chief Donna Hope, Stefan Walk, and Blaine Peters for helping me get out on the land. Even though this specific chapter is mostly desktop study, but I still learned a lot of the information that included in this presentation by going out on the land and seeing the permafrost features in person. So the traditional territory of the First Nation in the central Yukon spans from discontinuous permafrost to the south to continuous permafrost in the north in the Peel watershed. So the red circled area here represents approximately the traditional territory. This map displays the modeled ground ice abundance in the top 5 meters of permafrost. And on top of that, we can also see the permafrost zones. So this area spans kind of a north-south transect from continuous to discontinuous permafrost. And we can see in this model ground ice map that there's a lot of different colors going on. There's small areas, high ground ice abundance modeled, but also a lot of gray areas where there's no ground ice has been modeled. And this gray area specifically corresponds to a big mountain range, the Mackenzie Mountains, where permafrost is actually very variable due to the topography. So the permafrost distribution, but also the ground ice distribution in the area is strongly controlled by the topography, which changes within the sub-watershed, the Stewart watershed, which I'm going to focus on during this presentation from east to west. So when we're trying to map permafrost disturbances and understand the thaw sensitivity of such a landscape, we're really concerned about where the ground ice is. And that is, of course, because of the fact that ice-rich ground, when it thaws, responds very strongly by developing thermal erosion features like these retrogressive thaw slumps on slope terrain, or if the terrain is flat, then we'll mostly get ground settlement or thaw pumping and stuff like that. And these continental scale models of ground ice distribution, while they're really useful for a lot of things, they can't really capture the variability of ground ice in such a diverse mountainous discontinuous permafrost landscape. So zooming into the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Cho Nyäk Tagé here in orange, we can see that the northern parts are the Peel watershed. There's been a lot of permafrost studies going on in that area because there is such a strong abundance of retrogressive thaw slumps. I'm going to focus on this yellow watershed, which is the Nacho Nyäk Tagé or Stewart River watershed, which is a major tributary of the Yukon River. So it drains west here into the Yukon River. So this Dawson City, Whitehorse would be south in that direction, southwest in that direction. And Mayo is the main community in this watershed and in East traditional territory. It's a very small community with just over 200 people living there currently. This sub-watershed, the Nacho Nyäk Tagé watershed, is almost entirely within NND's traditional territory and also contains 93% of NND's settlement land, which is why it is very important to study this area. The climate is subarctic and dry, but we have a very strong warming trend of approximately 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade. And we're also observing that river discharge and precipitation, particularly rainfall in late summer and snowfall in the winter, are increasing significantly over the same time scale. This land has obviously been used for millennia by First Nations, and more recently has gained a lot of interest due to the rich mineral resources that are being explored by various companies. So why is this research relevant, and what are the objectives of the study? Well, permafrost landscape change, and particularly these large thaw disturbances and mass movements like retrogressive thaw slumps, are important for water quality and aquatic habitat. Specifically in the area, people are concerned about the habitat, spawning habitat for Chinook salmon, which were once very abundant, but are now seeing a rapid decline, but also generally important for land use activities, so overland travel and geohazard risks on the land, but also near the community. And we're trying to understand also the relative importance of these natural disturbances still induced by climate change to some degree, compared to anthropogenic disturbances in the area caused by mining activities, infrastructure development, and so on. These products of permafrost thaw sensitivity and geohazard risks are critically they can be used for land use planning. And the First Nation is currently starting with the land use planning project for at least a sub-watershed of this Stewart watershed. That's Tsetagé or Beaver River watershed, which is located here in the north of the Stewart watershed in yellow. And so this proposed Beaver River land use planning area is completely contained in the area that I'm studying, but is basically completely unstudied when it comes to permafrost distribution and permafrost hazards. So the goals of my project was to, first of all, map these disturbances. So how are they distributed within the watershed? Then I wanted to understand what factors makes terrain susceptible to these disturbances. So how can we characterize these areas that are seeing these thaw slumps? And then how can we model susceptibility across the entire watershed using machine learning methods? So as I already said, land use planning is essentially a key tool for the Yukon First Nations to exercise their treaty rights. This First Nation has signed their self-governance agreement in 1993, and in that umbrella final agreement, it was laid out for the First Nations to do the land use planning. And now we have 2024 or 2025 actually, and unfortunately, land use planning has not made a lot of progress, but it is on their way. And there's actually already two land use plans or one land use plan in effect in any traditional territory, the Peel watershed to the north. There's also a draft land use plan or recommended land use plan for the Dawson planning area, which overlaps ND's traditional territories landed to the west. And I went into these land use plans and kind of wanted to figure out, first of all, how is permafrost represented in these existing land use plans to inform myself on what kind of products could I contribute to the First Nation to help them progress with their land use planning efforts. So permafrost is mentioned in the Dawson plan quite a lot. As you know, this area is known for the Klondike gold field, so there's a lot of infrastructure and existing mining activities. And the way permafrost is mentioned in the land use plan also reflects that. There's a lot of talk about the impacts of permafrost thaw on infrastructure and how we can design infrastructure to mitigate the impacts on permafrost when we have to plan such infrastructure through discontinuous permafrost. And then there's the Peel watershed plan, which is already finalized, and permafrost is there mentioned a lot in the context of their ability to protect wetlands that are perched on top of the permafrost table. Across this watershed, we're seeing a lot of thaw slump activity as well. So to summarize, three major topics are covered in these land use plans. Permafrost wetland feedbacks, so talked about perch wetlands, thaw ponding, and of course there's quite a sensitive carbon pool stored within these permafrost wetlands. Then there's a lot of mention of geohazards, so slope failures, bank erosion, catastrophic lake drainage, and of course the increased sediment and nutrient fluxes into the rivers and lakes, which is posing a risk to aquatic habitat. And then the infrastructure risk to transportation corridors, housing, utility, and mining industry. And these plans also outline some research recommendations and management practice recommendations, including when new infrastructure is being planned, that has to be some kind of permafrost assessment to understand the impacts that this infrastructure could have on permafrost. So the first goal of my study was to map permafrost terrain disturbances in satellite imageries. I had access to cloud-free base maps, monthly cloud-free base maps from PlanetScope. They have a spatial resolution of 3 meters. And I essentially went systematically across the watershed and actually the entire traditional territory with less rigorous standards to map these terrain disturbances. And you can see in this map that 5 major watersheds are affected by thaw slumping across the traditional territory. Peel watershed to the north, and we have here the Stewart watershed to the south, which will be the focus of the rest of the study. So there's 664 thaw slumps mapped across the entire traditional territory and 790 minor thermal erosion features. Zooming into the Stewart watershed, there's 87 retrogressive thaw slumps mapped here. Not all of them are actually active, so I also mapped inactive or revegetated thaw slumps that were still visible in the landscape because they still represent terrain that is highly susceptible to thaw slumping, and 205 other thermal erosion features, which are here in blue. So red are retrogressive thaw slumps, and blue and brown are minor thermal erosion features. And on the background in this map, you can see the past glacial limits. So purple underlain is areas that were glaciated since the last glacial maximum, approximately 15,000 years ago. And areas west of the purple, so green and yellow, is terrain that has been unglaciated during the last glacial maximum advance. And one of the most striking observations, obviously, is that all of these thaw slumps fall within the limits of the Mekong glaciation. So how do these thaw slumps look on the ground? We have here some examples of photos that I took in the field with the drone from thaw slumps that are very typical, I would say. We have this typical bowl-shaped floor with a headscarp, with an exposed headscarp where the ground ice is exposed. We have a sediment flow that excavates the sediment through a mud flow, typically through this more narrow outflow. We have some examples of thaw slumps in different stages. Some parts are already revegetated, stable. This part is, for example, less active, but still somewhat active. This is the main active feature here. This is one of the largest thaw slumps near Mayo, actually, a few kilometers upstream, with very typical shapes. But then there's also a lot of thaw slumps that are a little bit odd or don't follow necessarily the textbook description of a thaw slump. We have smaller thaw slumps that have a thick fluvial overburden that is covering essentially the ice-rich material. So these thaw slumps are usually less active and a little bit slower. We have revegetated but still creeping thaw slumps. This one was active probably I think until the late 90s or something like that, but since then we're still seeing some ice circuit degradation in the head wall, even though the head wall is covered by organic material and debris. We have some asymmetrical thaw slumps that are partially stable, partially still active, including this stabilized block failure that is fully vegetated and contains permafrost. And here's an example of a more C-shaped thaw slump that is truncated by the migrating river, and parts of the thaw slump floor are annually flooded. In this case, we have the highest ground ice content kind of near the water level. So if you step into this thaw slump, you're kind of standing on massive ice, and the head wall itself contains less ground ice, again with some fluvial overburden. And then we have these very large hill slope thaw slumps that are mostly located higher up in the watershed, closer to the headwaters. These are some of the largest thaw slumps in the watershed. And with a lot of them, we can see that they develop this large debris tongue where all the sediment is, these thaw slumps are not necessarily, they're not connected to a major stream or river. And the sediment is deposited as overland flow on the slope. But yeah, some of these are the largest thaw slumps that we have in the watershed. This is particularly odd because it is facing straight south on a very warm, what you would think a very warm slope. I have never visited any of these particularly thaw slumps in the field, so I'm not quite sure what kind of ground ice we can find there and how this ground ice was deposited. I have visited a lot of these riverbank thaw slumps in the field, and we can see that they have really nicely defined head walls with a lot of ground ice in this frost-susceptible fine-grained sediment. A lot of these sediments are very typical of glacial lake sediments, mostly clay and silts. I have dated some organic material that I found in some of these thaw slump head walls, and it seems like some of these thaw slump show polycyclic behavior where they kind of stabilize after a few decades and then get reactivated maybe a few decades later. But based on some radiocarbon dates, some of these thaw slumps have been active for a few hundred years in the same position. Then I went back into the image archive to see if I can find the first time these thaw slumps appear in any available imagery, which included historical aerial photography, Landsat imagery since 1984, rapid eyes since 2012, and PlanetScope data since 2016. And in this histogram, you can see that obviously there's some type of bias where older thaw slumps may not be that visible in the landscape, but I was able to distinguish or identify some thaw slump, revegetated thaw slump scars that I could date back to an activity period in the late 1940s. So the earliest aerial photography from the area is from 1949. We can see some of these thaw slumps that are still visible in the landscape. So they represent terrain that is susceptible to permafrost thaw, because we do know that some of these slopes are still developing thaw slumps today. But we can still see the scars from 1949, and we can clearly see some a intensification of thaw slump initiations, especially in the past 20 years. So 64% of the thaw slumps that I mapped were actually active in 2023, and 36% are stabilized or revegetated features. Approximately 50-50 between riverbank RTS that are located on riverbanks and lake shores compared to thaw slumps located on hill slopes. So next, I wanted to model the susceptibility across the entire watershed using machine learning. In particular, I used the random forest model, which is an ensemble machine learning technique that essentially uses hundreds of decision trees that then vote on a prediction, essentially. So the random forest model is trained to differentiate between pixels that are known to be disturbed, which are the pixels that, or the features that I mapped in imagery, versus randomly picked undisturbed pixels. And each of these pixels are, of course, underlain by a variety of predictor variables that I use then to make these predictions and build these decision trees. So these predictor variables reflect terrain conditions that predispose the terrain towards disturbances. So a lot of derivatives from topography, but also superficial geology is really important. The hydrology, so how close each pixel is to the nearest water feature. And of course, the glacial history, because we already saw that these glacial limits play an important role in the distribution of permafrost terrain disturbances. So once the model is trained on our known disturbed pixels, the same, all other pixels essentially going through the same decision trees, and we can get a susceptibility value or a probability for each of these pixels, how likely it is that these are thaw slump pixels. So these are all my predictor variables: slope angle, slope aspect, topographic wetness index, distance to water, potential solar insolation, permafrost probability, which I got from a different study, but I mentioned all the glacial limits, which were mapped by the Geological Survey of Yukon, some landform classifications, some topographic position indices, and elevation. So when selecting the training points for these random forest models, one of the decisions that I had to make is how many points per feature do you use for training? As you can imagine, if this is the mapped thaw slump star, we could use all these pixels underlaying the thaw slump scar to train our model. The model would be very good at predicting these thaw slumps, especially the larger thaw slumps that are contributing a lot of training points to the training process. Another approach would be to take only 1 point for each of the thaw slump scars, or a lot of studies also use 3 points, one for the head, the center, and the toe of the thaw slumps, or landslide features. After playing around a little bit with these approaches, I settled on taking every 6th pixel in the thaw slump scar for my training, because if you take all pixels, essentially the model is overtrained on the very large thaw slumps compared to the small thaw slumps. In this approach, each thaw slump would have the same weight during the training. And then essentially you balance out the data set by generating random points sampled across the watershed that are known to be undisturbed. Finally, the entire data set is used to predict the susceptibility across the watershed, and this is the final result. So the susceptibility is then classified into zones of very low, low, moderate, high, and very high susceptibility. And we can see that a total of 10.7% of the entire watershed is susceptible to thaw slumping, meaning it has a probability of above 5, which doesn't mean necessarily that this land is truly susceptible to thaw slumping, but it's more likely that this land will develop thaw slumps than it won't. So there's no clear boundaries. What land can develop thaw slumps. Land with the lowest susceptibility may as well develop thaw slumps. How well is this model performing? So first of all, I did a tenfold cross-validation, which I'm going to go into more detail soon, but we had a good average ROC value. ROC value of 93% is pretty good, which means that this model was very successful at classifying disturbed versus undisturbed points. Here's the thaw slump that I missed during the initial disturbance mapping, and we can see that this feature, which was not at all used for the model training, falls nicely into the very high susceptibility zone. And what we can also see is that the upslope boundary of the current thaw slump scar kind of borders actually very low or very low susceptibility terrain, which could be an indication that the thaw slump is close to stabilizing, since the terrain above the head wall is not really characteristic of susceptible terrain. One of the difficulties that I had actually is how do I validate such a model where the number of training points scales with the area of the thaw slump. I already talked about how the more points you take for a big thaw slump, the more weight that thaw slump will have on the training of the model. I used a tenfold cross-validation, which means essentially you split the entire data set into 10 equal parts, and then you essentially use each 10% of the data set each time as independent validation data, so that in the end, 100% of the data was used for validation across the 10 validation faults. What it discovered is that area-based landslide susceptibility models like that lead also to biases in a traditional tenfold cross-validation, because the points of large features also get randomly sampled into each of the validation faults. The way I tried to mitigate that was by actually using a non-traditional cross-validation, where I forced thaw slump features to be intact, and all points of one feature had to go into one validation fault. This leads, unfortunately, to uneven numbers of observations across the validation faults. And it can only also lead to, again, that individual validation faults are overtrained on few large thaw slumps. So choosing the right validation technique is important to avoid overestimating your model performance. So in this example, I compared actually the two validation techniques, where in the traditional cross-validation technique, essentially each cross-validation fault has points from all of the large thaw slumps. You can see that this model is overtrained on these features, and we actually have really inflated performance metrics. So the average susceptibility of undisturbed points in their role as validation features is 16%. The average probability of susceptibility of disturbed features in their role as validation features is 84%, compared to the new technique where we force features to be intact within validation faults. The average susceptibility of disturbed points in their role as validation features is only 68%. And we can also see in the average all-rock value, just performance metric across the entire 10 validation faults, that this value is also inflated for the traditional cross-validation method. So what variables were actually the most important for the prediction of susceptibility? The great thing about random forest modeling is that it does give you an estimate of the importance of each predicted variable. And we can see that the elevation, the glaciation history, the permafrost probability, the slope angle, the distance to water were the most important predictive variables. So terrain that is susceptible to thaw something typically was glaciated since the last glacier maximum, has an elevation between 600 and 1100 meters in this watershed, has a very cold local climate, meaning high probability of permafrost presence. It's close to a river or a stream. It's usually on the lower slopes of a hill with a shallow slope angle between 5 and 20 degrees. And it was very obvious that most of these thaw slumps appear on slopes that are facing northwest to northeast. I also trained the second model to distinguish between riverbank and hill slope thaw slumps because there was such a neat composition of almost 50-50% hill slope versus riverbank thaw slumps. And this model was very good at distinguishing terrain that is susceptible to riverbank thaw slumps versus hill slope thaw slumps. And one of the things that I learned from this model is that, again, that the susceptibility to riverbank thaw slumps is higher across the main rivers and streams of the watershed. So these larger glaciated U-shaped valleys have a high riverbank thaw slump susceptibility, and the susceptibility to hill slope thaw slumps was higher at higher elevations in terrain that was not necessarily connected to the major rivers and streams, but more to the smaller streams higher up in the headwaters. So far I've only talked about the susceptibility towards thaw slumps, but I said that I also mapped 200 minor thermal erosion features. So I trained the second model on a combination of thaw slumps, where I only used 3 points per thaw slump feature and all of these minor thermal erosion features. And in this map, you can see just the difference between these two susceptibility models, one trained only on thaw slumps and the other trained on all permafrost terrain disturbances in the watershed. And what was very visible is that the susceptibility towards all kinds of permafrost terrain disturbances was higher in the lower reaches of the watershed. So west of the past glacial limits, which is just a further indication that this kind of minor thermal erosion is widespread across warming discontinuous permafrost, while these thaw slumps require very specific and localized slope conditions. How can this susceptibility model be used for land use planning? Well, I said at the beginning that this watershed contains a land use planning area, the Beaver River watershed planning area. And one of the ways that I see this model be used by the First Nation government is that you can subdivide the susceptibility model into sub-watersheds of this watershed. You can also analyze susceptibility within each of the landscape management units of a potential land use plan. It also allows for easy assessment of planned corridors. For example, there was a access road planned by a mining company a few years ago, and now the First Nation has a tool where they can do a simple GIS buffer analysis essentially and verify what kind of permafrost conditions are to be expected in these kinds of proposed infrastructure corridors. In this example, we could also see that the susceptibility in the subwatershed was on average higher than across the entire Stewart watershed. So it's important to go into smaller units and analyze the susceptibility at the local level. And in conclusion, this model gives us a better understanding of how the susceptibility is distributed and what factors are regionally important. In this case, most of the thaw slumps appear on north-facing slopes in cold local climates. So this ground ice has been there for thousands of years, and in this discontinuous permafrost landscapes, ground ice was preserved only on the coldest slopes that are strongly shaded currently and are facing towards the north. The future initiation of these disturbances within the susceptible terrain, of course, strongly depends on weather conditions, hydrology, and the wildfire conditions in the future. But we are seeing a strong warming trend. We are also seeing a strong trend of summer discharge in the rivers, which initiate a lot of the riverbank thaw slumps, and a lot of late summer rainfall that has the ability to initiate hill slope thaw slumps. I did not use any superficial geology data for my model training. It would have been nice to have that data. Unfortunately, it wasn't available for the entire watershed. So it's important to fill these kinds of data gaps across the Yukon, in my opinion, to allow for more accurate thaw susceptibility model in support of land use planning efforts by the First Nations. And finally, a recommendation that I would give for a future land use plan would be to limit the development of infrastructure to low susceptibility zones. And if development is needed in susceptible terrain, it's important to do more detailed local permafrost studies to understand the geology, the permafrost conditions, and the ground ice distribution at a very fine local scale. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
I have a question. Thank you very much for very educational, very interesting information. So your factors of those slumps are more geographical, right? So you didn't go underneath the earth in terms of ice content, or you just say you just generally look at the quaternary deposits and probability of high ice content associated with certain type of quaternary deposits. Do you have any factors, let's numerical factors, let's say if you have a ice content more than 50% or something like this?
So I didn't use any products that actually depict the ground ice content in my model training. At the very first slide, I showed that ground ice distribution map modeled by Neil. I did not use that in my susceptibility model just because the resolution of that product didn't work out, and it didn't seem to be super relevant with that highly variable topography in the area.
And the north face slopes or terrain is usually more icy, right? They are susceptible to the thaw slumps because the ice content is higher, right? You said historically they accumulated more ice content. Why the north slope is more susceptible?
So it's not necessarily that they accumulated more ground ice over time. It is probably more a result of where the ground ice is left in the landscape. There was some past warming periods. I think around 6,000 years ago, there was a warming period in the area where temperatures were similar to today. And previous studies essentially discussed how south-facing slopes during that period were drained of their ground ice content, and what is remaining are the very cold north-facing slopes that are now being reactivated with anthropogenic climate change.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a quick question about when you selected your points for validation, or I guess when you developed your your data set to train the model, the point data set, did you ever think about leaving some of your thaw sums out so you could have an independent validation of the data set instead of doing like a k-folds just as a test?
Yeah, I ultimately decided against that just because my sample size is so small. I only have 86 thaw slumps across the watershed. I didn't want to leave any out for the final model training. So essentially I did the tenfold cross-validation and then trained my model again on 100% of the data. And based on this cross-validation, I essentially argue that the performance of this model is probably as good as the tenfold cross-validation.
Gotcha. And then the 3 points, I guess, are there a lot of studies that you mentioned that some studies you've seen have used 6 points within the feature, or you use 3, but I guess maybe just a bit of like thought that would go into, like, I don't know if you limited where those 3 points could be selected from, because when you showed your photo or you showed the image and you had points kind of equally placed throughout the entire scar and the debris tongue, I would just like thinking whether or not you'd want to pull points from the debris tongue to help train the model, because that isn't the terrain that would have initiated, like where that feature would have initiated, and whether you would limit your point selection to train the model to perhaps upper half of the feature, if you did or didn't, I guess.
My main model I trained on not only 3 points, but I selected every sixth pixel in the area. And then I had a second model that I trained on 3 points for RTS feature and 1 point for any minor thermal feature.
Okay, that was my mistake on that.
In that case, the 3 points were just selected based on I automatically generated the longest axes of the polygon and plotted them at equal distance.
Okay, so you might have
So
been,
in some cases, depending on the shape of the thaw slump, it doesn't even necessarily represent toe and top of the thaw slump. Yeah.
but I guess in some cases it could represent like the toe or the debris.
Right. Yeah. I didn't include debris tongues
Okay.
in my polygons. Yeah.
Okay, no, that helps. That clears things up a bit. Thank you.
Derek, go ahead.
I'm wondering, what do you think it is about the age of the surface or the relation to glacial limits that causes retrogressive thaw slumps to form or not form? Is it like a time and quaternary climate change thing, or is it a distribution of materials thing? Do you have any insight into that?
So I only visited the thaw slumps that are appearing along the riverbanks in the field myself, so I can mostly speak of those. And those were all found to be, with the exception of maybe one or two, they were all forming in glacial lacustrine sediments. So essentially, kind of the story to piece together is it's a story of periodic forming of glacial lakes as the glaciers retreated up the valleys into the headwaters of the Stewart watershed. And since then, most of these glacial lake sediments have been eroded through probably riverbank erosion, but also just thaw slumping across the past few thousands of years. So the places that we're seeing thaw slumps in currently are essentially the remnants of these glacial lake deposits in the right location on these north-facing slopes that allowed for the ground ice to be continuously frozen since the end of the glaciation or since the formation of the ground ice in these frost-susceptible sediments.
So it's kind of both of those things, that there's more glacial lacustrine in the younger surfaces, but also they haven't had time to thaw and lose their ground ice.
Right.
Is that correct? Yeah. It's interesting because I wonder if that then suggests that, because there are still glacial lacustrine sediments beyond that limit, but did they not form ground ice at the same time as the McConnell age, like the younger sediments did, because they were not saturated or something in the same way, or maybe they're just not in the right locations. I don't know. I don't know if you have.
That's an interesting question, actually. I'll think about that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Part of the presentation, you were saying that some of these slumps have been going on for hundreds of years. Would you elaborate on that? I haven't heard much about it before.
Yeah. So maybe what I was trying to say is that we have some slopes in the watershed where we're currently seeing large thaw slumps, especially these large hill slope thaw slumps. And on these same slopes, or kind of near them, we're seeing old thaw slump scars that identified to be thaw slump scars from thaw slumps that were active in 1948, 1949. So that's the first evidence that we have this behavior of reoccurring thaw slumps on the same slopes. And we also have an example of the large thaw slump near Mayo, which I'm showing you some photos of those. Of this large thaw slump, which is a recent thaw slump that also appeared in a location where there was a thaw slump just a few decades ago. So this behavior can be seen across the watershed. Now, there was a few thaw slumps where I collected essentially organic material from within the head wall in supposedly glacial lake sediments, but it was obvious that these organic materials a few meters down were essentially deposited there only a few hundred years ago, 190 years ago in one example, based on radiocarbon dating, which suggested that this material was reworked in a previous thaw slump 190 years ago, deposited, formed new ground ice afterwards, and is now being displaced again by the thaw slump.
Steve Wolf here. I'm just thinking about the hill slope thaw slumps and then the river thaw slumps. Have you separated them out to look at historical timing of both of those and whether or not with this activity that's going on in a given years or decades that they're both being activated at the same rate, or if they've been activated at different rates or times? Partly because I'm then wondering about the drivers of the thaw slump initiation and whether the river ones are actually they're driven by the actual hydrological river processes, whereas the other ones are being driven by something else. So could you sort of comment on a little bit of that?
Right. Oh, that's great. Great question, actually, or great comment. I have not looked into specifically into the differences in the initiation between them. I kind of have that data, I guess. I haven't looked at it yet. The data set is obviously very small. There's only like 40 thaw slumps in each category. But I think it's fair to say that these riverbank thaw slumps are mainly initiated by lateral migration of the river channel. And the hill slope thaw slumps are probably more, I would say, probably more susceptible to the impacts of increased rainfall, for example, and forest fires and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to thank Frederic for a wonderful presentation, and we'll see you all next week for Natalie's.
Thanks, everyone.